To achieve the title of master, he completely destroyed all the established traditions that had been created by his ancestors for many years. Because of his mastery of the sword, he has been called the greatest spearman of all time. A great hero who was able to put an end to the long civil war of the most powerful empire of Avalon. On the vast continent of Igrant, this guy was known as a hero, and his name was Joshua Sanders. But the strength was not eternal, and the very day came when he had to admit his weakness, and this end looked too pathetic for such a great spearman. One of those who was present at the time of his fall added to him that it was impossible to combine combat skills with divine power, because this was essentially a deadly combination. After all, having united in one body, these two forces cause confrontation, and he is lucky that he is not an ordinary person, otherwise he would have died long ago because of this. The guy didn't understand why they were doing this, because in fact, he never even had the thought of usurping the throne. Such a thing didn't even interest him. All he was interested in, and what he really wanted, was to show the world the greatness of a weapon called a spear, and ultimately get rid of the sorrow of a vicious circle. He wanted to be a shield that defended his empire for the rest of his life. He just wanted to help his emperor, his only close friend, put an end to the empire's long civil war. A man in a white outfit approached him and told him that there are people in the world whose existence in itself poses a great threat. The Lord of the Magic Tower Evergrant added to him that now that the civil war was over, the emperor had risen to the highest position, where he could achieve whatever he wanted without any threat. And the only problem at the moment is that the emperor is afraid of only one person, and that was that same Joshua. All this was based on the fact that even warriors who spent their entire lives training to master mana, it takes decades to apply mana to even a tiny dagger. But Joshua could wield a spear that was strong enough for at least two people combined, because the guy managed to perfectly control energy and his strength. The Lord knew very well that the guy still had energy inside his body because he had passed another wall. After which he raised his magic ball and said that he saw it falling to the floor of the ruins of Ammon, which made the guy's insides clench, and the pain was incredibly strong and unbearable. Another man intervened in the dialogue and said that he too was terribly afraid that this guy would just look at him and stab him with that damn spear. Now they continued to speak almost in one voice and thank Joshua for his help, because without him, they probably would not be where they are now. The ruler was sincerely grateful to him for everything he did for him and for their empire, but now it was time to say goodbye and move on to the next stage. After all these words, Joshua still could not stand it and died from such pain and from the spells that were cast on him. The emperor could not look at all this, no matter what kind of person he was, yet this was his old friend, and it was hard to watch his death. The guy shouted with all his strength so that Caesar Ben Britain would not think that this was the end, because soon they would all regret it. But each of them seemed not to hear this scream, and they all walked together and smiled, because finally they had lost their last problem. Joshua was surrounded by a magic circle of explosion, and the guy was well aware that, given its scale and area, he had approximately 5 minutes before the explosion. He was so offended that all his life he had been the greatest knight of all time, who was ultimately betrayed by his faithful friend, and who would have to end his life in a nameless wilderness. The ritual began to take effect, and he didn't even have hope for a miracle. He looked at his legendary spear, which was called the Reaper of the Battlefield, and thought that he might never use it again. Joshua decided to enjoy his weapon for the last time and reached for it using all his strength. He always thought that a special power was hidden in it. But he could not even imagine that the spear would reveal it at that very moment and give him a little hope for success. A few seconds after he finally reached for his drink, an explosion thundered, which could only mean one thing. Joshua Sanders met a futile end that belied his reputation as an invincible knight of the lance. Suddenly the little boy came to his senses again and found himself in some stable in which he did not understand how he ended up. Joshua's consciousness clearly remembers how he died in the explosion, but now he has turned into a child who looks at his hands and does not understand how this could happen. The thought occurred to the guy that what seemed simply impossible to him was that he could really become younger and return to his small body. The boy looked around him and realized that this was the place where he lived before, and he essentially returned to the past. But how did this happen? But this did not worry the guy too much, because he only thought that he had received another chance, and now he was sure that with Caesar, Ben Britain, everything would be completely different. But suddenly he was interrupted by several guys who looked like knights and immediately attacked the little boy, because they did not understand what he was doing here when they told him to clean up horse poop. Joshua knew that these guys were most likely the personal army of the Duchy of Agnes. One of them rudely began to shout at him because he wanted to hear at least a word from him, but his colleague interrupted him and said that the boy was deaf and there was no hope that he would be able to somehow answer. The boy was not stupid and deliberately pretended that he could not speak, because if he had opened his mouth, he would obviously have gotten a lot more. At one point, they stopped paying attention to this boy, because one of them suddenly realized that he had not seen Lucia for a very long time, and the second asked him to be quieter, because the Duke visits this maid from time to time. Lucia was the name of the Duke's personal maid, who was also the mother of little Joshua, so they decided to speak more quietly so that she could not hear. As it turns out, he is the illegitimate son of a maid who was raped by Duke Agnes many years ago. Since the corpse's personal knew this, they viciously tortured him because he had noble blood, which gave them great pleasure. Especially these three who stood right in front of him, and one day the little boy swore to take revenge on them at all costs. Lloyd decided to make a joke about the fact that he wanted to see Lucia today for some reason. Rolls kicked him and said that he would like to look at him if anyone heard it. But Lloyd told him that he was worrying in vain, because in this provincial stable no one could hear them. Well, except of course little Joshua, with which his friend could not but agree. Besides, Duchess Vanessa said that even if they get rid of Lucia and this bastard without anyone's knowledge, she will take responsibility. They thought that now was just the perfect time for this, but unfortunately, Lucia is not here, so they will not be able to do this. But in any case, they believed that they had a backup option in the form of little Joshua, so they decided to have fun with him until she returned. The boy was already at the peak of his anger, and could not just listen to how these guys were going to leave somewhere after they insulted his mother. He understood that he was now in a body that was not capable of fighting such opponents, so he was not sure that this could work. The way in which he uses the mana technique he learned is different from the normal methods that were used before his return. The mana technique he discovered in the ancient ruins with his favorite spear, which he called Rugia. It was capable of reaching its peak in an instant due to the earth-shattering impact that could shake the world, but what was also equally important was that the mana technique he had learned had a completely different method of operation. This is done not by storing mana in the core, which is located under the stomach, but by using mana from the environment. It is not limited to a small plate called the mana core. It also concentrates mana where it is needed to release it instantly, but it did not go through the mana core formation process that everyone who uses mana needs. Thanks to which he skipped the process that takes others years, so nothing can be done about his quick start as a mana user. While Joshua was thinking about whether he could use mana, one of those guys suggested surrounding this guy and just kicking him, because he was filled with anger just by looking at him. Lloyd joked with him that Gort seemed to be in a bad mood, because he was rejected by the very lady he had been missing for so long, which the guy really didn't like, so he asked him to shut his mouth. Gort came closer to Joshua and warned him that today he was not going to hold back, so he might not count on mercy. The little boy just stood silently with his eyes closed, so they started joking that he fainted because of fear. They thought it was very funny. Joshua at that moment only thought that he only needed a handful of mana. Before his return, it took him 10 years to figure out how to move at least such a handful of mana. But today, everything will be different, because now he knows perfectly well how to do it, and the most important thing is that he was perfectly prepared for it. As soon as the boy opened his eyes, this action immediately enraged Gort, who immediately took the stick in his hands and ran to beat him. Joshua gathered all his strength into a fist and struck with all the strength he had, but Gort could not even imagine such a thing, so he did not block. After such a blow, he will have to lie on the ground for a while and move away, because the concentration of mana that Joshua collected was quite large, and therefore the blow turned out to be quite strong. The friends of this robber could not believe their eyes that this little brat was able to deliver such a blow and such a force. After such a blow, Joshua felt something sticky and disturbing under his stomach. It was a very strange feeling that he had not noticed before. Lloyd decided that the guy was crazy to do this to his friend, so he pulled out his sword and decided to punish him in this way. Joshua knew very well that it was too dangerous to go against a trained soldier with this child's body, but if he could take down Lloyd, then Rawl was unlikely to attack, because he was the most cautious of the three. Therefore, the kid decided that he would try to do it again, so that it would not happen to him, and he was almost sure that everything would work out for him. Lloyd did not wait long and immediately went on the attack, threatening the guy that this would be his last day, because he was going to simply destroy him. But what was the guy's surprise when this little guy was able to dodge his blow, because before, they hadn't noticed this behind him, but in any case, it didn't change anything. It didn't change exactly until he saw how the little boy was accumulating mana in his right hand and simply could not believe his eyes. He didn't have to watch for long, because Joshua decided not to wait, and immediately dealt a serious blow to this guy as soon as he had enough mana in his hands. Rolls looked at all this and realized that no one could even guess that this little one, who doesn't even speak, hides such power within himself. The first time it could have been an accident, but the second time this is already an indicator of strength. Joshua at that moment did not think about how strong his blow was, because he felt incredible pain throughout his body due to the fact that mana was accumulating in it. The little boy understood that Rawls is the one who rose to the rank of centurion thanks to his wit, not skill. He is no better than Lloyd and Gort, but in any case, he is much more dangerous. Therefore, Joshua firmly decided that he could not show weakness in front of him, and decided to ask this brat to convey a message. Rolls was not only surprised that the guy was so strong, but in addition to all this, he was surprised that the kid could talk. Joshua did not pay attention to his fits, and continued to say that from now on, anyone who insults his mother, including the centurions, will not survive. Rolls looked straight into his eyes, and an incredible amount of fear ran through his entire body, which made it very creepy. Therefore, he didn't find a better solution than just running away, and shouting that it was a little monster, Rolls simply disappeared. Joshua looked into the distance as this idiot ran away, and realized that his strength was leaving him in the same way, because for such a body this was too much mana consumption. Therefore, he still could not withstand such a load and fainted from powerlessness. Several men were discussing that apparently Joshua, the mute kid from the stables, had beaten the crap out of 3 centurions. One of them even heard that there was a rumor that he was only pretending to be mute all this time. The man thought about the fact that young Master Joshua beat 3 centurions, although he was more than 5 years younger than young Master Babylon, and there was clearly something strange about it. The last one who intervened in the dialogue between this troika did not believe in all this nonsense at all, because how can one believe that a mute child whose family abandoned him a couple of days ago is capable of beating 3 centurions with his bare hands? They agreed with him on the one hand, but on the other, each of them perfectly understood that the position of the children of Duke Agnes by inheritance could change. Although even if Joshua's skills are recognized, he will not be able to defeat young Master Babylon, so all this talk is still a waste of time. The guy supported him, because the young Master of Babylon had already begun to use mana, which only indicated that his strength would grow every day. In that case, even Grand Duke Agnes, who is a master now, only became a mana user at 16, and young Master Babylon is only 14 and already a mana user, so he must be an outstanding genius. They even assumed that one day he would displace even Duke Agnes himself, but the man categorically disagreed with them, because who could compete with him for the inheritance is simply impossible. But suddenly their conversation was interrupted by Master Joshua himself, who appeared too unexpectedly, and they did not even have time to react to his appearance. The little boy did not listen to this man and ordered him to immediately go and tell the Duke that Joshua had arrived. Meanwhile, Rolls was at a reception with Caesar, who knew perfectly well who Rolls was, but did not quite remember which detachment he belonged to. Rolls was very worried when he spoke with such a person, because for him it was an incredible honor, so he immediately answered him that he was in the 29th Battalion. My lord knew very well that the 29th Battalion was Grimmen Chiffon's unit, which Rolls himself confirmed. After which they brought armor to my lord, which was all tattered and damaged, so the man could not believe that little Joshua had done it. He was also approached by a guy who served my lord and asked Rolls to tell only the truth, because if he said even one wrong word or lied somewhere, then his life would hang by a thread. Rolls, of course, was nervous and understood that this was too serious, but still found confidence in himself and said that everything he said was the purest truth, and not a single word was exaggerated. As it turned out, the guy who was standing next to him was the same Chiffon who led the 299th Battalion, and he added that in this case there was no reason to doubt Rolls's words, but it was still hard to believe. My lord absolutely agreed with him, because now the boy is only 9 years old, which is very young to have such power. The man understood that it was quite impossible for a boy to destroy orc leather armor at that age with his bare hands, only if he did not use mana. Chiffon interrupted my lord and asked for forgiveness for his rudeness, but he believed that using mana was a very complex process, and at that age, completely impossible. The guy also added that there was not a single case in the history of the continent in which someone could use mana in a real fight at the age of 9, of course, unless this boy later turns out to be a genius unprecedented in history. The man was well aware of the fact that you would need to be at least a talented B-rank knight to cover your hands with mana, so both he and Chiffon simply could not believe that 9-year-old Joshua could do it. After which Chiffon turned to Rolls and told the guy that it seemed more like to him that people were afraid that others would find out about his abuse, and therefore came up with a meaningless excuse with their useless brains. So the guy asked the Lord for permission so that he could teach Rolls a lesson and drag him out to correct the deteriorating discipline of their army in front of everyone. But even now, Rolls proved to them that he was telling the truth. Chiffon was seriously angry and told him not to even think about raising his voice in the presence of the Duke, and he also forced him to immediately tell him the truth, which he was hiding so ardently. Rolls tried to tell him again that he was telling only the truth, and nothing but it, but the captain did not believe him, and was already reaching for his sword to teach the guy a real lesson that he was unlikely to forget. But he was stopped in time by the Lord himself, who did not want to see this, and Chiffon tried to tell him that they could not leave everything like that after the rumor that he had spread. The Lord stood up from his table and told the captain that the time had come to find out the truth, which would come to them after they met Joshua. It was time to meet him. For the first time, the Lord wanted to look at him for himself. Chiffon could not believe that the Duke would go himself just to see the son of the concubine, because the man did not show such interest even in the young master Babylon, who is called the greatest genius of the empire. But his thoughts were interrupted by the Lord, who wanted to know where they could find Joshua, to which Chiffon answered him that he had just received news that the guy had arrived, so he should be on the first floor. In the corridor of the Agnes mansion, a little boy saw Joshua standing and waiting for the Lord to come out to him, which made him very angry. Joshua at that moment was looking at the portrait of the current emperor of Avalon, Marcus von Britain, from which the anger inside him begins to tear and rush, so he had no doubt that he would take revenge on him. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice, from which he turned and saw a blow flying at him, which it seemed would be very difficult to dodge. But Joshua coped with this task and caught the little master's fist, which was quite unexpected for him. The little master looked into his eyes carefully and could not believe that the rumor that everyone was talking about was really true. But in any case, whether it was true or not, he was taught not to give up without a fight, so he immediately began to form mana in his hand. It would seem that the battle was inevitable, but in time, the Lord and Chiffon came out of his office and stopped this madness. The little master immediately knelt down and thus greeted the Duke. The Duke was not too interested in these greetings of his, because the guy did not answer him what he was going to do here, to which the boy answered him that they exchanged cordial greetings. After which he decided to find out the opinion of the second boy, who in turn simply nodded back to him, which was quite disrespectful and bold of him. Even Captain Chiffon noticed the fact that this guy dares to answer Agnes's question with only a nod. Has he really gone crazy? Still, he could not stand it and ordered the boy, who did not kneel down, to do this and greet Mr. Agnes properly. But all that Agnes noticed at that moment was that the young guy's gaze was filled with malice, which was the purest truth, because the guy looked at him so much that it became scary what was going on in his head. Joshua at that moment was still only thinking about the fact that he looked at that portrait, and it reminded him of the face of that scumbag, and now anger is boiling inside him, which is tearing him apart from the inside, so he cannot control his emotions properly. The boy understood perfectly well that showing his emotions in such a place is not the best idea, because Agnes does not allow people who show their hostility to leave so easily. But suddenly, Agnes called the guy to him. At the moment, the man only wanted to know one thing. Was this young guy able to use mana at such a young age or not? The little master could not believe his ears that Joshua could use mana. It was out of the realm of science fiction for him. He always thought of him as a petty degenerate who was always just a stable boy and cleaned up shit all day, and now they want to test him for the use of mana. Chiffon tried to dissuade my lord from doing such pointless tests, but the man did not even want to listen to him and continued to ask the boy to come closer to him. Joshua thought about the fact that Duke Agnes is one of the 5 masters of a huge empire. He is much more sensitive to mana than anyone. The boy understood that if he discovered something anomalous, his plans would come to an end. The guy didn't have time to notice how Agnes approached him and already took his hand to conduct a test. As soon as Agnes took the little boy's hand, he immediately felt an incredible energy that he had never seen before. What could it be? Joshua looked him straight in the eyes and was well aware of the fact that the only person who could detect whether he was using mana or not was Agnes. But suddenly, for the guy and for the others, my lord let go of his hand and said out loud that he didn't see any mana, but still his facial expression changed. The little master was delighted when he heard this. He was already sure that this bastard could not fill his hand with mana, but hearing it from my lord was even more pleasant. Chiffon told him that he wouldn't find anything there. In principle, there shouldn't have been a trace of mana there, but as it turned out, Agnes wasn't talking about the core. He told him that a person should initially have at least a little mana. Even ordinary civilians and simple monsters have mana, but Joshua does not have it at all. Chiffon knew very well that when a person lacks mana, it can only mean one thing, that he is no different from the dead who move thanks to demonic forces. But after his thoughts, he still added that perhaps there were cases when someone was initially born without mana. He had heard such stories more than once. Perhaps they are true? Agnes understood that all this was too unnatural, because in the place where the mana core should be, there was some kind of sticky mass that emitted negative energy. From that moment on, the Duke decided that he would keep an eye on the guy and how he behaved, because he did not like this whole situation too much. But he was interrupted by Chiffon, who believed that if the guy has no mana, then all the rumors and stories that are told about him are simply not true, because if this is so, then they cannot leave the centurion for spreading rumors. Agnes told him that the centurion also belonged to the duchy, and punishing him for information that they were not entirely sure of was a very bad idea. But as for Joshua, Agnes decided that from now on he will live in this palace for some time, especially since there are a lot of empty rooms here. The little master was shocked when he heard everything that Agnes was saying, because he didn't want it so much, because he doesn't like this guy. My lord looked at him with just one look, which could only mean one thing, and it seems Babylon understood everything. After which, he turned to Chiffon and asked him, starting tomorrow, to teach Joshua knighthood, if he is talented. Then my lord also asked him to teach him the method of using the mana of the Crimson Knight. Chiffon did not quite understand this request, because young Master Joshua had no mana at all, but my lord believed that they had plenty of time. They would definitely find out everything if they were patient, because on the one hand, it was even better that he had unnaturally little mana. After which Agnes went back to his office, and he told little Joshua that he would look forward to meeting him again after training. A few minutes later, Chiffon led young Master Joshua to his room, where he would stay during the training process, which was quite unusual for a guy. Chiffon looked at this boy and thought only that the rumors that he was mute were true, because it seemed that he could not even express happiness after being given such an honor. Joshua noticed that Chiffon changed too much once the Duke left. Now his behavior is rude. But in any case, the guy didn't care much about this now. He just wanted to lie down on this bed and fall asleep soundly, because he had a really difficult day. The guy recalled the phrase that the Duke told him before leaving, that he would be waiting for him in a year, and the little master was very pleased to hear this, but at the same time, it was somehow strange. Joshua had some knowledge that Duke Agnes spends most of the year in the Golden Palace of Acadia, the capital of the Avalon Empire. Most likely he returned to his domain to get some rest. The boy was most worried about the fact that the Duke could feel something that the boy himself does not know about himself, and it doesn't matter what it is, because in any case, it is very dangerous. In any case, the guy understood that now all these details are not really important. The only thing he needs to achieve now is to regain his former strength. That same night, the boy decided that he could no longer sit in his room and wait for something, so he decided to take a short walk. As soon as the guy decided that now he could use such an amount of mana much easier, and he even had thoughts that he could regain his previous strength much earlier, but suddenly he was interrupted by unbearable pain. He understood that the negative energy in his mana core was mixed. It was most likely the same demonic and holy energies that mixed with each other and thereby fought in his body. And then it dawned on him that the force that was holding back this confrontation was Rugia. But he couldn't figure out how it got into his body and was holding back this force. There was no time left to think, because several court guards heard some strange sounds and immediately moved out to check what happened there, and Joshua had to immediately hide. What he did successfully, as soon as the guards went around the corner of the palace from where the sound was coming, they saw nothing there, which was very strange for them, because they were sure that they had heard something. Joshua ran with all his strength, but he didn't notice it, because he was only thinking about how he could combine all three forces in his body, and Rugia should somehow help him with this. From one of the hangars came the screams of a woman who had been captured by the same trio that Joshua didn't like so much. They were angry with her, that because of her son, their reputation was at rock bottom. The woman was not a simpleton, and decided that she would not tolerate such a mocking attitude towards herself. So with all the force of her bite, the guy who was holding her. But in any case, the male power was still stronger, so he pushed her to the floor for this, and it seems that in this way she worsened her situation even more. One of them took her by the hair and told her that he wanted to do the best he could, but apparently a woman couldn't just stand there, so they decided that they would act completely differently. But suddenly, the guy asked Gort whether it was worth doing this, because if Joshua found out about this, then it wouldn't be sweet for them, and most likely they would suffer. Gort was not the type to give back, so he immediately said that he absolutely didn't care whether he knew or not. He remembered why he was here and they wanted to destroy it. But still his friend continued to stand his ground and tried to persuade him not to do it this. Gort had already started shouting at him and told him that if he was so afraid, he could pack his things and leave, and he would do this, especially since the Duchess said that she would take full responsibility upon herself. They came closer to the woman, who had lost consciousness from the blow, and decided not to waste so much time, and if someone was scared, they could run away like a cowardly girl. As soon as they gradually began to bring the sword closer to her body, they were suddenly interrupted by a voice that stopped them. It was Joshua who, in their opinion, came slightly at the wrong time, because if he had come to them a little later, they would have shown him a funny picture. Rolls understood the seriousness of this situation and asked him to calm down and not say too much. But little Master Joshua, it seemed, could no longer be stopped, because his anger crossed all boundaries, and he promised the guys that they would not even think that they could get out of this place alive. The woman recovered from the blow and saw through the pain her little son, Joshua. Rolls, unlike them, was the smartest, although he was a coward, so he immediately told them that they needed to run because Joshua would kill them all. But the guys asked him not to talk nonsense. They considered him just a coward. Joshua did not wait long and told these guys to immediately leave this hangar, to which the guys responded with laughter and told him that this time he would not get off easy, and they would send him straight to hell. The boy continued to speak in his own language and asked him to come out of the shadows and show up. The guys didn't understand what he was talking about. Had he really gone crazy? But suddenly, just out of nowhere, a guy appeared who came down right from above and was quite surprised at how the boy was able to see him. This young man's name was Knight Cain, and the first thing he asked Joshua was how did he manage to sense his presence. Joshua at that moment drew attention to his cross, which could only mean one thing. This is one of the 3 knightly orders of Duke Agnes, and this one belonged to the Order of the Crimson Knights, and it was logical to assume why such a knight would follow Joshua. The Troika, who had just threatened the boy, suddenly changed their faces and now greeted him as an honored guest. Knight Cain approached the boy and thought that he was the hero of the rumors about the concubine's son, but Joshua did not behave like a courtier and immediately asked him to answer one question. Joshua started by saying that the soldier tried to harm the lady of the Duke's house. According to the military regulations of the Duke's house, what would happen to the soldier in that case? The knight looked straight into his eyes and realized that someone was controlling his consciousness, and he could not resist. The force was too overwhelming. After which he still could not stand it, and at one moment turned around and took out his sword, and this was the answer to the little boy's question, namely, immediate punishment. Without thinking for a long time, the knight took out his sword and went to attack one of the guys, who simply did not expect such a turn of events. Because of the surprise, the guy didn't even have time to block, so the knight dealt him a fatal blow. One of the trio decided that it was necessary to launch a counterattack, because it was possible to get hit just as well. But he forgot that he was fighting against an experienced knight who knew all these tricks better than him, so it turned out that Cain dodged the blow and still delivered his own. They asked him to stop and stop this senseless battle, but the man did not seem to hear them and continued to go into battle. The guy asked with all his might to spare him, but all the knight answered was that he had better shut his mouth if he wanted to live at least a second longer. He was suddenly interrupted by Joshua, who was a little unhappy that even after he said to stop, the knight did not stop and continued the attack. Cain answered him that he wanted to punish them for harming the Duke's wife. This guy was one of the 3 generations of knights that are known in the duchy, but he belongs to the Crimson Knights, who are considered the weakest. Also, most likely, he is one of the youngest, if he could not resist Joshua, but after seeing how he defeated the centurions with one swing of the sword, he was sure that even among the knights of his rank, he was the strongest. The boy interrupted what the knight wanted to do so badly and asked him who he served. Knight Cain turned around with confidence and answered the young master that he served only Duke Agnes. This answer was not enough for Joshua, and he decided to ask the knight who he was to him then. Cain at this moment was almost sure that he was in the right direction, and the way he thought it was in reality, he looked like him. Joshua did not wait for an answer, and asked Cain to lower his sword, which the knight did. As soon as the sword was in the case, Rolls immediately fell to his knees and began to thank the count for such great kindness. Now he will serve only him, because he essentially saved his life. But Joshua made it clear to him that he did not need his devotion. He would never allow anyone who dared to raise a hand against him or a person close to him to live and continue to breathe. But he was convinced that he was smart enough to understand this, and he also ordered to tell this story to other soldiers. While the guy was crying from such words, Joshua continued to tell him that if anyone dared to do something like that again, he would cut their throats with his own hands. After everything Joshua had just said, he advised the guy to disappear as quickly as possible. The guy, without thinking for a long time, ran out of the hangar. He was overwhelmed with fear, so without thinking for a long time, he ran. The only thing Joshua was worried about at that moment was his mother, who was lying almost unconscious and did not fully understand what was happening. Knight Cain approached the guy and decided to check with him whether he was the count that everyone was talking about, to which Joshua answered him that the knight was a fairly straightforward person. Cain was surprised that he had changed so much, because the count he remembers was, and then he was interrupted by Joshua, who continued, the illegitimate son of a duke, who does nothing but shovel shit. The knight suddenly turned to the count and said that all the soldiers allocated to the Duchy of Agnes carried out the orders of Duke Agnes, but the boy did not quite understand why he said this. After which he added that they could independently choose their master, whom they would serve until the end of their days, upon reaching the age of 23, and in a year the Knight Cain would also be faced with this choice. A man trusts his instincts. Throughout the next year, in addition to fulfilling his duties, he will watch him so that he can then make the right decision. Joshua believed that a good decision would be to choose the treasure of the Duchy of Babylon von Agnes, but not him, if you look into the future, but in any case, it made the boy smile. Suddenly their dialogue was interrupted by Joshua's mother, who had recovered and now felt much better and was warmed by the fact that her little son was safe. Joshua ran to hug her, and from that moment made a promise to himself that he would definitely protect his mother. He was truly grateful to heaven for giving him a second chance to correct the past, which was filled with regrets. He was sure that this time everything would be different, because from now on he would not be so timid, not like Joshua von Agnes, the humble, illegitimate child from the stable, but like Joshua Sanders, nicknamed the strongest spearman in history. Meanwhile, in the mansion of the Duchy of Agnes, my lord asked Chiffon whether Count Rebecca had visited them, to which Chiffon answered him that yes, and he took him to the reception room. But there was one nuance that the captain announced to him. This time he did not come alone, this time Miss Iselin was with him. The unwanted visitor that came so unexpectedly to Count Agnes, Count Rebecca, despite the fact that he has a lower status than the Duke, he is someone who cannot be ignored due to his influence in the empire. And his daughter, Iselin Jeanne Rebecca, one of the most talented people, she and Babylon are carefully watched. She is a magic genius who reached 2nd grade at only 9 years old. There are people who cannot use mana because of the curse, but there are those who are able to use mana better than anyone because they have received the blessings of mana. Iselin was one of those who was blessed with mana, which allows the user to sense and use mana without having to learn it. Also, some people call this skill the greatest gift of the gods among mages. And Agnes perfectly understood the reason why Count Rebecca came with such a treasure. He just wants to bother the man all day long, that's all. Chiffon decided to say that Count Babylon will turn 15 next year. One can say that the throne is already his, because there are not even 3 years left before his coming-of-age ceremony. Moreover, Babylon already has Lady Charlie, who is ready to become his bride and queen at any moment. The 5 duchies of the Avalon Empire have enormous power and influence. Lady Charlie is the daughter of the Font family, who received their title of dukes for their wealth. Chiffon reminded the man that he himself said that it was better to choose Lady Charlie if we consider the Duchy of Font. Of course, Agnes is of the same opinion, but this is unfortunate for him at the moment. After all, Agnes's greed for talent is immeasurable, just as immeasurable as his greed for military power. He is the man who judged others only by their skills. Chiffon saw perfectly well that something was clearly tormenting the Duke and not giving him peace, so he decided to clarify what was wrong, to which Agnes answered him with his own question, namely, he wanted to know how Joshua was doing. The captain didn't quite understand why the Duke was asking such a question, because they had just been talking about something completely different. After which, Agnes added that he told him that he would give Iselin to him, so he needed to prepare properly. Chiffon did not expect such an answer, and was shocked when he heard this, after which he still added that Lady Iselin has the blessing of mana. She is clearly not suitable for the young master Joshua, who does not have this skill. Joshua knew that north of the garden of the Duchy of Agnes, there was an old rock that the boy wanted to climb. Before his return, he often climbed it to be closer to his late mother, but in this body she seemed too tall for him. And on one of these frequent trips to this mountain, the little boy found a hidden passage in which he later discovered Rugia. With the help of a small spell in which he used his blood, Joshua opened a kind of portal that opened up a completely different world for him, which he entered without hesitation. He was not at all scared, because he had already been to this place and knew perfectly well what it was like. This place looked like a huge castle that was destroyed due to some explosion or war. Joshua was a little shocked when he saw what happened to this castle, and thought a little about whether this was the castle at all. When he first got here, it looked less like ruins, and the Rugia was on the altar in the center of the temple, all in chains. But now, instead of a sword, there was some kind of rod, which Joshua took up without thinking about the consequences this might have. Suddenly the rod began to glow with an incredible light that you couldn't just look at, so you had to close your eyes. At one point, Joshua found himself in some incomprehensible place, in which there was absolute emptiness, but all this was only at first glance. But his thoughts and guesses were suddenly interrupted by a very strange voice, and it was the voice of the very rod that was calling the guy to him. Joshua was slightly surprised by this, although he had seen a lot in his past life. But for an iron rod to speak to him, this was the first time. But the rod itself interrupted him and said that he was not who the guy took him for. As his interlocutor told him, he is an artifact of the demonic god Rugia, which the boy simply could not expect. He immediately thought that Rugia, the spear with which he fought, was an artifact of a demonic god. But he was worried not only about this question, but also why his appearance had changed so much. Was it because she went back in time with him? But suddenly, his thoughts and guesses were interrupted by an artifact, which made it clear to him that in fact, the guy had no time division. After which he added that the two energies in his body will destroy him over time, and there is only one way in the world to pacify them and then even use them. He advised Joshua to regain his strength as quickly as possible, because in his condition, he would have to reach the 4th stage of magical spear handling. The boy understood perfectly well that the ancient spear technique that he studied, the magical handling of the spear, gave him unprecedented power and strength in all his battles. All the knights of the Igrant continent used only swords and nothing else, and each of them at that time believed that spears were a weak and useless weapon. However, before Joshua returned, he managed to prove to them all that they were deeply mistaken, and before he returned to the body of a little boy, he was at the 5th stage of development. If we talk about ranks, then at that time only A-rank knights could create swords using mana. Masters were the absolute and strongest warriors. Although back then the magical skill of the spear was divided into 8 stages, at the 5th stage he was already considered the greatest knight of all time. So Joshua knew very well that if he reached the 4th stage, he would not be inferior in strength to the strongest B-rank knights. In theory, of course, this shouldn't be too difficult for him, considering that he had already done it, but he had very little time. The boy understood that in the state he was in now, it would be extremely difficult to train mana. But this demonic artifact seemed to read his thoughts and told him not to worry, because as long as he was around, he could use mana to some extent without consequences. He added to him that the boy needs to constantly study and improve his skills, and when he reaches his peak, he will thereby return strength to Rugia. But before the boy had time to ask a few questions, Rugia began to disappear and finally said that he would definitely fulfill his dream, which he had been pursuing for so long. A moment later, the bright light again began to fill the entire space, and it was not completely clear what was happening. But as soon as the light disappeared and the guy returned to his consciousness, he saw that Rugia was in his hands, and now he felt all the power that he could receive. Joshua remembers very well what Rugia told him, that as long as he has this rod, he will be able to use mana to some extent indefinitely. A mana cultivation technique that no one else on this continent can master, the ability to absorb at least a handful of mana from the environment. All this is called the first stage of spear mastery. Joshua hadn't been this happy for a long time, but now his mood was much better. He finally did it. The first stage of magical spear handling, the first style, is to concentrate mana at one point and direct it forward to hit the target with an explosion. Joshua struck the wall with incredible force and mentally only thought that this was only the beginning of his journey, and Caesar von Britain would soon feel uneasy because the guy would sooner or later take everything from him. Meanwhile, Duke Agnes himself and his assistant Chiffon arrived in the reception room of the Duchy of Agnes, each of whom thought that there were actually many more guests than they thought. The first guest to greet the Duke was young Cheryl Defont. Agnes was surprised that she was here at such a late hour. After these words, a man intervened in the dialogue and asked to accept his apology because Lady Cheryl's advances did not stop, so they were forced to pay him a visit. The Duke gave him an immediate answer that there was really no need for an apology. Even though they live in the same city, they rarely get to see each other, so this is a great opportunity, which the distinguished vassal of the House of Font completely agreed with. All Font House products are checked by him. Agnes decided not to waste the opportunity and suggested that the man work in his house if he apologizes so much and really wants to make amends. Lady Cheryl decided to answer this question, who told the Lord that despite the fact that they had not seen each other for a long time, the Lord still went too far. How could he so shamelessly try to steal someone's treasure? The Duke could only respond with laughter because he finally recognized the same Cheryl he knew. Her respectful greeting made him wonder if he was really talking to Cheryl Defont. Cheryl continued the conversation and added that she heard that Babylon has already reached C rank, so she is thinking about becoming a famous genius too. Cox immediately began to ask for forgiveness from the Duke, but he reacted to all this quite calmly and said that at her age it was normal to react like that, so everything was fine. During this small conversation, Agnes completely forgot about his main guests, so he apologized to Foncel for this. Foncel Jean Rebecca and his daughter Iselin stood calmly and waited for the Duke to finish and give them his attention. Iselin Rebecca, after the Duke finally turned his attention to them, greeted him no less respectfully than Cheryl. Lady Cheryl was quite unpleasant to see that Iselin was also present here, so she held back her emotions. Cox tried to calm her down, but it didn't work out well for him. After which she added that information had reached her that the Duke's illegitimate son had beaten 3 centurions, and she was very interested to know if this was true. Cox couldn't stand it and literally started shouting at her because her behavior was too unbearable. You can't say that in the presence of the Duke. Cheryl turned to him and was surprised by his reaction, because it seemed to her that she had not actually asked anything like that. She was just curious to know about it. Chiffon decided not to wait for the Duke's answer and told her himself that it was just a rumor. Young Master Joshua is not only weak in body, but also has a mana curse, so such a person could not physically beat the 3 centurions. Foncel Jean Rebecca, without listening to the end, was shocked by the information that the second count has a mana curse, so he wanted to know how true it is. The Duke decided to answer this question rather unexpectedly, saying that now there was an opportunity to look at this kid, if he was so interested, which made Foncel even more surprised. Agnes added that it seems Foncel is one of the few magicians of the 5th level of the Empire. A magician like him is more susceptible to magic than a knight like the Duke, so he would like the man to look at Joshua. Foncel understood that it was absolutely not necessary to do this, but on the other hand, he perfectly understood that he could use this opportunity to improve his position in the eyes of the Duke, so he agreed without further ado. Chiffon interrupted their conversation and suggested that the Duke first look at the condition of the young Master Joshua, but the Duke did not quite understand what the captain was talking about. After which, Chiffon added to him that it would be better to confirm if Joshua has a mana curse before sending him to the capital, so they can also find out how true the rumors are. The Duke did not quite understand how Chiffon was going to do this, to which the captain answered him that if he could call a suitable knight from his banner so that they could have a duel. Agnes was quite surprised when he heard this proposal, because in essence he was proposing to summon a knight of the Crimson Order just to fight the 9-year-old. Chiffon explained his proposal by saying that if the rumors were really true, then someone of exactly this level was needed, and it so happened that the captain already had a suitable person in mind. He was 100% sure that if the Duke saw this with his own eyes, he would definitely be satisfied. The next day, in Chiffon's office, he discussed with Kane his report, in which the knight described the situation in which he had an altercation with the centurions. Captain Chiffon agreed with Kane that, in accordance with military regulations, he had the right to subject someone to immediate punishment, but still the guy believed that it was a hasty decision. But as soon as Kane said that these centurions wanted to endanger the lady of the Duke's house, Chiffon immediately stood up from the table and now understood why Kane reacted that way. Chiffon could not believe that these scumbags dared to do this to Lady Vanessa. But Kane corrected him in time when he said that they did it not with Lady Vanessa, but with Lady Lucia. At this moment, Chiffon calmed down his ardor a little and repeated the name Lucia again out loud. After which he sat down at the table and asked the guy again, "Does he want to say that he put 2 centurions out of action for the sake of a concubine?" Kane explained to him that he considered Lady Lucia to be a respectable lady of the Duke's house. She was not someone who could be harmed by ordinary soldiers. Moreover, their actions were both an insult and a challenge to the Duke. If his captain believes that he did something wrong, then the guy is ready to be punished. Chiffon was silent for a while and thought about Kane's words and decided to say that they would not pay much attention to this, and besides, the knight had a new task. The captain looked him straight in the eyes and said that today he would have a sparring match with young Master Joshua. Kane did not expect such a turn of events, so he visibly began to get nervous and asked again what he had just heard. Chiffon confirmed this information and explained to him that they would do all this only to find out whether Master Joshua had a mana curse or not. True, the captain believed that without a doubt the result would still be a natural mana deficiency, but the Duke still cannot believe it, and thinks that this will become a big problem for the young master of Babylon. Kane decided to clarify whether the captain thought that the young master of Babylon could be removed. Chiffon's reaction was immediate, and he asked the knight not to talk nonsense, because Master Babylon is a genius that cannot be found on the entire continent. Chiffon believed that such a prodigy could not descend to such a level as to kick all sorts of pebbles again. At this time, Kane thought that the pebble that Chiffon was talking about was actually a meteor that opened the endless sky to destroy everything on Earth. Therefore, Chiffon believed that all he needed to do was inject mana into Joshua during sparring, and no one should notice it, because if he had a mana curse, then his body would reject this mana, and everything would be clear. Kane listened as Chiffon talked about how when mana enters the body of a person with a mana curse, it acts like poison, so the person dies after 10 days, and thought about the fact that Chiffon had always been on the side of Babylon, but he did not even suspect that the captain will show his face in a similar way. In the end, the captain summed up the results, and if the knight understood everything, he ordered him to wait near the small field for sparring. Soon the Duke and Chiffon would be there. Kane was already on the small sparring field, and thought that even if this was an order from his superiors, he still would not harm Master Joshua as long as he was keeping an eye on him. At that very moment, Master Joshua came into this hall, walking here purposefully. After all, he knew very well that they would have a sparring match, and the boy seemed to be 100% ready for this. Kane confirmed this information and said that they organized all this only to test the Count's abilities. Joshua, on the one hand, was surprised, but on the other hand, it even made him happy, because it seems the Duke found out about his abilities and wants to look at them, and the guy didn't mind demonstrating them. His thoughts were interrupted by Kane, who said that there was no need to worry because he was not going to fight the Count at full strength. To which Joshua replied that the knight was really going to test him. The knight did not mean this at all, so he tried to explain everything to the little lord. But he interrupted him in time, saying that he knew that they had the right to choose their lord. Exclusive power was given to the knights. But Joshua knew very well that, on the other hand, he had the right to choose his subordinates. Therefore, Joshua added to him that he does not plan to trust his back to someone so insignificant and weak. And if the knight wants to see his true strength, then he should try. And besides, his sword is needed for this. Their dialogue was interrupted by the Duke, who came in with the guests, and was pleasantly surprised that the guys were already in the hall and began to get to know each other. Cain, as befits every knight, greeted the Duke and ducked away. Chiffon at this time watched as Joshua again did not show any respect towards Duke Agnes, and was now 100% sure that he simply did not have it. But suddenly, Jusha bowed to the Duke and greeted him no worse than Cain, which was quite good. The Duke did not remember being taught etiquette, but he praised him for doing a good job. Joshua told him that he is constantly learning by watching everything that happens here. Agnes praised him again and asked if he knew what would happen here now. To which Joshua, with a calm face, answered him that information had reached him that the Duke wanted to test him. Chiffon could not stand such words and still explained to the young master Joshua that there was a misunderstanding. This is not a test of the Duke, but his attention to the boy. He wants to better study Joshua's illness, which is possible in the future to cure him. Joshua mentally didn't quite understand what this man was talking about. But then he remembered that this was Chiffon, and he had always been on the side of Babylon, so you shouldn't be surprised by this. But time passed, and it was necessary to start, so the Duke asked the guys to get ready, and they would start the fight. The Duke saw how Cain was ready for battle, so he explained to him that he had misunderstood. Today Joshua's opponent would not be him. This role will be taken over by the elder brother Babylon, who was also there and was fully prepared to teach his brother a lesson. Duke Agnes warned them that this was primarily a training fight, so they would use wooden swords. Babylon already understood this perfectly well because he was not even going to fight his brother at full strength. Joshua understood that Chiffon and Babylon were conspiring to put on a show in which they would destroy him, but for the guy this only caused a smile. While he walked to his wooden sword, he thought that he also wouldn't mind putting on a show and showing them how it's really done. Joshua stepped on this wooden sword with all his strength to break it, and clearly did it on purpose. After which he picked up everything that was left and added that this was enough for him to fight. This made Lady Cheryl laugh a lot, and she noticed that he was a very funny kid, which was hard to disagree with. Chiffon turned to Joshua and explained to him that this was not a joke, but a real fight, in which this stick would not help him in any way. As soon as the captain wanted to take it from Joshua, he was stopped by the Duke, who asked him to wait and asked the guy if he was sure that this stick would help him. Joshua turned to him with a confident face and said that this is what he needs so much in this fight. After these words, all that remained for the Duke was to ask all the guests to take their places, because the duel would soon begin. But before that, the Duke turned to Babylon and told him that he had no right to use mana. Babylon asked his father not to worry in response, because in his mind he was sure that using mana on this bastard would be a waste of energy. Master Babylon immediately began to speak aggressively to Joshua, saying that he would never be able to handle him with this stick, although on the other hand he believed that it was very suitable for him, because it looked like the shovel from his stable, which he used to remove shit. As soon as the boy finished with his fiery speech, the Duke ordered them to begin the duel. Babylon immediately rushed into battle, not giving Joshua time to even think, but he was slightly surprised that his opponent knew several techniques, but in any case, this would not help him. At this moment, Joshua only thought about the fact that his opponent is a C-rank knight, but he is quite ordinary. The only thing he has is speed. Therefore, Joshua did a great job of landing a blow on one of the guy's arms, which began to surprise Babylon because how dare he even touch him? His anger went beyond all limits, so he began to say things that should not have been said, such as the fact that Joshua is an illegitimate child who cannot even be a soldier. But before he could finish speaking, Master Joshua dealt him another blow, only this time it was on his stomach. Joshua was extremely concentrated on the fight and thought that, after all, Babylon talks a lot, but he knows how to fight. But his thoughts and fair fight were suddenly interrupted by Babylon himself, who decided to strike, but not simply, but using mana, which was very dangerous at such a distance. The Duke could no longer look at this fight calmly, so he ordered Babylon to stop this madness immediately. But it seems it was already too late, because after these words there was an explosion, which was very dangerous for the lives of the guys. Everyone who was at this fight was sure that there was nothing left of Joshua, but when the fog cleared, everyone was shocked that the little boy was using mana in his wand. Fonsel couldn't believe his eyes that this guy was using mana. Is that possible? Babylon, who watched Joshua use mana, could not believe it either. But at one point, it didn't matter to him again, because he couldn't accept the fact that the heir to the dukedom would not be him, but some foundling. Joshua knew very well that this duchy would disappear in 10 years during the Civil War, but if he had a place where he would be supported, it would be much easier for him to realize his plans. Therefore, he was not against responding in battle and also trying to get this dukedom. But Agnes doesn't repeat it twice, so he stopped the fight immediately, and it was difficult to resist such a force. The man made it clear to them that none of them would be forgiven if they continued to fight. Chiffon was no less evil than his favorite Babylon because Joshua is only 9 years old, and he is already using mana. This is the first time in history. In other words, this is an amazing miracle. Suddenly Foncel spoke, interrupting Chiffon, who so wanted the fight to continue. The man said that judging by what he saw, it was definitely mana at such a young age. True, he believed that it was not as much as the Count of Babylon, but it was different from any other mana that they knew, especially judging by its concentration. Cheryl was so shocked because this means that this child can really use mana. Kane supported Lady Cheryl and added that no one could have thought that Joshua was such an amazing person. It was also surprising for Duke Agnes to see that Joshua could use mana at such a young age. Chiffon still couldn't believe it and tried to somehow resist it, but the Duke made it clear to him that it was enough to try to change something. After which, the Duke approached Joshua and said that he would need to sort out several things, so he asked the boy to come to him in the evening. Babylon couldn't believe that he was really hearing this, because everyone who was in that room knew perfectly well that the Duke did not invite anyone to his room. How did this little farmer manage to come to this? Joshua was pleased with this invitation and replied to the Duke that he would definitely come. After such a performance in one of the rooms of the Duchy of Agnes, Lady Cheryl jumped with happiness on the bed and told Cox that these were simply amazing things, and it was simply impossible to calm her down, no matter how hard the man tried. She also couldn't believe the fact that a 9-year-old child was able to use mana, considering this fact. Isn't he the best? After which, she added that now she had decided, before that, she was worried that he was illegitimate, but now she knew that his name was Joshua, and Lady Cheryl would make him hers. Vanessa von Agnes was too angry when she heard how her son Babylon was fighting with some illegitimate child, and therefore decided to take it out on Chiffon, who just told her this news. But these were still flowers compared to the fact that Chiffon added the fact that Master Babylon eventually lost to Joshua. What almost blew Lady Vanessa's mind, she was so angry that she was ready to kill someone. She couldn't stand it, and still hit Chiffon for what he had just said. She couldn't believe the fact that Babylon used mana and still lost the fight to some farmer. When the lady calmed down a little, she asked the captain what the Duke thought about this, to which Chiffon told her that the Duke had decided to take Joshua to the city. Even after such a slap, Chiffon could not hold back his words and continued to talk about how from the moment Agnes saw Joshua's talent, he decided to keep the boy close to him to observe. In any case, Chiffon believed that they would be in a difficult position if they allowed this to happen. But Vanessa believed that it was primarily Chiffon who was to blame for this, because he did his job poorly. He immediately decided to justify his actions and told the woman not to worry, because he would fix everything and return everything to its place. but she did not quite understand what he meant, so she asked him to explain. After which, he added that this was just his assumption, but he was sure that Duke Agnes would want to let the entire empire know that Joshua was a mana user of rank, but the queen believed that all this was complete nonsense. Chiffon explained to her that not only the Duke, but also 2 counts saw Joshua's abilities with their own eyes, and even if it was not mana, the Duke would want to test him anyway. And in order to do this, and the fighter is officially recognized as a knight of C rank, they must demonstrate their skills in a real battle against a royal knight. After such words, Vanessa immediately changed her face and repeated to herself that the little boy would have to fight with the royal knight, and this made her very happy, so she decided that it would be a long time before she contacted her uncle. Joshua did not wait long and immediately came to the Duke's office, as he asked him to do. The boy became much more well-mannered and immediately got down on his knee in order to greet the Duke, to which he immediately received a question from the man, "Who is he?" The guy thought a little about what to say to him and still decided to say that his name was Joshua von Agnes. The Duke looked at him a little and noticed the fact that the boy had changed too much since the last time Agnes saw him and immediately wondered how much the boy hated him. Joshua told him that he didn't hate him. He was just afraid of the royal palace and hid his abilities, so he couldn't expect much from the guy. But still, the guy has some request that he would like to convey to the Duke. The Duke did not expect such words from his illegitimate son, but still asked what he wanted. Joshua explained to him that this request was directly related to their trip to the city, because he was 100% sure that the Duke was going to take him with him. The Duke was slightly surprised by these words, but he was still very interested in asking the guy why he thought so. Master Joshua explained to him that he had 2 reasons. Firstly, until that moment Babylon was his heir, but then Joshua intervened in this idyll, so he would have to get him out of here to avoid trouble. The Duke was slightly angry, but not at the boy, but at himself, because now he understood that Joshua was very talented, not only in fighting, and if only he had noticed it earlier. The second reason why the Duke will take the boy to the city is because the Duke himself will let the boy go. After all, if Joshua could become strong enough to surpass Duke Agnes himself, then the Duchy of Agnes could rise again, perhaps so much so that they wouldn't even have to worry about the royal palace. Agnes answered him that while he listened to all this, he got the impression that the guy had enough strength for this. Joshua was confident that he would at least do everything so as not to disappoint his father and his family. The Duke thought that this young man was clearly unique, because not everyone can be so confident when standing in front of the Duke, so the man decided to ask him if he knew an option that satisfies these requirements. Joshua completely agreed with him and added to him that the Duke must be thinking about sending the boy to the Acadia Academy. All children of noble blood must attend the academy for 6 years, from the age of 10 to 15, and there is also the possibility of graduating earlier for those who have the same abilities as Babylon. The reason the royal palace created this system was to keep children in the academy, to maintain the loyalty of the nobility, and recruit outstanding talents. Agnes confirmed Joshua's words that he boy would indeed go with him to the city. In addition, the Duke would be able to personally teach him if he was next to him. Joshua was quite happy to hear this, because this was an excellent opportunity to learn the art of the sword from one of the 5 masters of the empire. But the boy had one caveat. Instead of a sword, he would like to use a spear as a weapon, because with it he feels much more comfortable. The Duke, of course, was surprised by this choice and desire, but now he clearly began to understand the fact why the guy fought with a stick in the battle with Babylon. Agnes released a huge amount of mana from his body and once again asked Joshua if he really wanted to use the spear. It was difficult for Joshua to give a clear answer in such a situation, because a huge amount of mana was released directly at him, and it was difficult to resist it. It was hard for the guy to stand on his feet, but as much as Agnes is proud of his sword, how proud Joshua is of his spear. Therefore, he firmly told the Duke that he would destroy anyone who stood in his way with a spear, even if that someone was one of the 9 stars like Duke Agnes. The man found it very funny to hear such things, so if he was so confident in himself, he asked Joshua to show everything he could do with his spear. One of the 9 stars of the empire decided to test the boy's strength, which was quite good for Joshua, because such a good opportunity might not present itself again. After these words, the Duke asked the guy if he could cope with such a task, to which the guy answered positively, but he would have one condition. He asked the Duke that if he could pass his test, Agnes must promise him that he would listen to his request. Agnes did not mind fulfilling such a promise, and promised him that if he passed the test, he would be able to use the spear, and he would listen to his request. However, the Duke himself had a condition. If the guy fails this test, he will be obliged to listen to the Duke. Joshua understood perfectly well what request the Duke would have. Most likely he would need to go to the academy and study the art of using a sword, but this would not happen, because the boy was not going to hide his abilities. After a lot of time, Vanessa again talks to her beloved uncle about how he is doing and how he is doing, to which he confidently replied that everything is fine, because he still lives in the palace. Vanessa listened to him for a while and decided to still say that something actually happened in the duchy, so she wants to ask him for a favor. Joshua left the Duke's office, and as he expected, the man was a very amazing person. But suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by someone's voice, and it turned out to be Babylon, who was serious about talking to Joshua. Joshua didn't want to talk to his older brother, so he turned around and told him that they had nothing to talk about. Babylon didn't like the way this pompous guy was behaving, so he invited him to fight again right now. Babylon's look was significantly different from how he was in the training battle. Joshua knew full well that this need for victory, passion for battle, and desire to never lose would destroy Babylon, so he asked his brother if he was sure of his desires. In the great imperial castle of the Kaltika Palace, the emperor of the Avalon Empire, Marcus von Brighton, laughed at the fact that another talented child had appeared, who was now rumored to be from the Duchy of Agnes. His courtier confirmed this information, and the emperor could not believe that Vanessa could hide someone like such a guy. As the courtier explained to the emperor, this guy was not her son, and it seemed that was why she was silent. Now, the story for the emperor was even more interesting. An illegitimate child who, according to rumors, was also born from the Duke's maid. Marcus was very interested to hear that Babylon alone is already a treasure, the like of which cannot be found in the entire empire, but Duke Agnes already has 2 treasures, which even the emperor could envy. The courtier tried to tell the emperor that the princes were also quite talented and would one day shake the world, but these were empty words because the emperor did not believe in it. Marcus understood that some could become emperor, but he was embarrassed by the fact that in terms of combat power, they were too weak. The emperor has not thought highly of them for a long time, but the princes are also talented, all because the emperor himself is so strong that he is a master, so his standards are extremely high. Maybe that's why his desire to have talents is so excessive. Marcus decided that if Duke Agnes was no longer going to hide this child, it might mean that he was at least as powerful as Babylon. The courtier added to the emperor that there were rumors that Babylon lost to this boy in a one-on-one battle, and Marcus was shocked by this. The servant told him that the boy was actually 9 years old, which did not fit into the emperor's head. A child who had recently turned 9 years old had defeated the miracle of the continent. Marcus was very interested in listening to this. He believed that people would soon begin to arrive in the capital to see with their own eyes the skills of this child, which the courtier could not disagree with, who said that it was so. And he also heard that an order would be sent knights at the request of Duke Agnes. Summing up, the guy decided to say that this child is already very close in strength to a C-rank knight. The emperor really liked to hear this formulation, because C-rank at the age of 9 is very lucky for the empire. For him, this situation became more and more curious. The emperor's courtier listened to his master and understood that perhaps Marcus would want to personally test the mana of this child. The emperor is an empire. His influence goes beyond the bounds of human imagination. As soon as the guy decided to ask whether the emperor would go, suddenly Marcus himself interrupted him and said that he would really like to go, but he couldn't because of the jackals, who were eager for any opportunity to get the emperor. The man had another more interesting idea about this. He asked the courtier to send one of the princes to this matter, because this matter was very important to him. The emperor must have a keen eye for talent. Joshua delivered such a powerful blow to Babylon that he had to block and was still thrown aside. Babylon cut his hand on his own sword, but he was not thinking about that first, but about the fact that Joshua used mana on his bare fists and gives him so much strength. Joshua distracted the guy from his thoughts, because it seemed to the boy that his brother had everything written on his face. After which he changed his stance to a non-combat one, and slowly approached his brother with the words that he would help him realize how scary the martial arts he looked down on could be. Babylon was very offended by these words, so he went into battle shouting that underestimating him was the worst mistake Joshua could make. Joshua looked at the blow that his brother was throwing, and all he did at that moment was accumulate mana in his hand. After which he pushed out all the energy that he could accumulate during this period of time, and after that an explosion of aura thundered, which was able to throw Babylon several meters back. The guy couldn't believe that he collected mana in a certain part of his body and used it against him. Babylon didn't want to admit, but it seems he'll have to do it. Joshua is much stronger than him. Joshua immediately approached the guy, in whose eyes he saw fear, and told him that he would never forget what he felt when Babylon fell from the hands of the one whom he had looked down on for so long. The boy added that if he could do what he wanted, he would tear Babylon apart for everything he did, the one who insulted his mother and Joshua himself. But this will not happen, and for the first time in a long time, Joshua finally saw the desire to gain power in his brother's eyes, so this time he will let him go. But before leaving, Joshua warned him that if he did not change his attitude, the guy would make it so that he would never be able to hold a sword with his hands again. After these words, Joshua decided that it was time to leave and finally added Babylon so that he would always remember that there was a colossal difference between them. The next morning, Joshua woke up with the thought that he was physically very tired. He was using too much mana without a break. Since he absorbed Rugia's personality, controlling mana has become much easier, but with such consequences, does that mean that his body is not capable of withstanding such an amount of mana? Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, and it seemed that it was Cain, whom the guy had recently called, who had come. But as soon as he opened the doors, instead of Cain, there stood a girl whom he saw for the first time in his life. This was the same Cheryl Defont who came to visit the guy, because she heard that he was 3 years younger than her, so she could calmly communicate with him. She did not wait until Joshua himself invited her to enter the room and came in with the words that he could call her big sister if it was more convenient for him, especially since they had something to talk about. But Joshua didn't think he needed guests that much at this time, so he put his hand in front of her face and let her know that he wasn't very happy with her here. Then he leaned a little closer to her and whispered for her to get away. The guy closed the doors right in front of her nose so that it was so unexpected for the girl because no one had ever done this to her. Cheryl stood like a statue and didn't know how to react to this, leave, or perhaps try to enter his room again. Joshua didn't understand what kind of jokes this early, and it seemed the girl wasn't going to give up, so she continued to knock on the doors, which made the guy think about just ignoring her. But the nerves didn't last long, and the guy couldn't stand it any longer. He was embarrassed by the fact that the girl didn't understand the first time. Joshua decided to open the doors and tell her to get the hell out of the way, but he did not expect that the knight Cain was standing behind the door, who was frightened by such threats, and invited Joshua to come back later. But the guy immediately apologized to him and said that there was a slight misunderstanding. He didn't want to shout, he just confused him with someone else. Joshua got distracted from the main thing, so he decided to ask Cain how things were going with what he asked him to do, to which he received a positive answer, because the knight Cain did everything in the best possible way. But the knight, of course, did not fully understand why the young master needed this. Joshua didn't explain everything to him, but simply asked him to trust and listen to him, and then everything would be fine. In the large sparring field of the Duchy of Agnes, Rawls stood and did not touch anyone, when suddenly several of his colleagues decided to make fun of him that Joshua could beat him and his 2 friends. They thought it was very funny. Rolls continued to ignore them, and the guys decided that recently he was somehow strange. He stopped talking altogether. They even thought that he had tormented Joshua so much that the boy's illness had been passed on to him. In any case, their only concern was who called all the centurions to this place, to which one of them answered quite simply, he was told that this was a knight of the Order of the Crimson Knights, and today's training would be difficult. Suddenly a loud voice shouted and warned that now it was necessary to greet the knight Cain, who came out to the centurions not alone, but together with Joshua. Rolls immediately began to get nervous, because he perfectly remembers the words that Joshua said before letting him go, but on the other hand, he could not know this. Suddenly, the thoughts of each of them were interrupted by Cain, who notified them that it was Joshua who would conduct today's training. The guy did not wait for his introduction, and he himself said that for today he would be responsible for their training, and his name was Joshua von Agnes. First of all, the guy said that they are centurions who will fight in the vanguard during the war, so their individual skills are most important. And Joshua himself came here in order to evaluate the skills of each of them, so he asked them to come closer to him. Several centurions, who had no idea what the count was capable of, began to laugh at him and decided that the boy had simply decided to play around here. Cain also asked Joshua again if he was sure of this decision, because he was still a count. The centurions warned the boy that even if he was a count, they would not spare him, and most likely he would suffer greatly, so they asked him to think about it again. Joshua grabbed the staff from Cain and walked up to one of the centurions, after which he pointed his weapon at him and asked what he thought about this. Rolls immediately began to panic and try to explain to Joshua that he would never have thought that. But the boy did not listen to him and asked him to close his mouth, because based on the reaction of the centurions, we can conclude that he did not keep his word and did not say what he should have said. Rolls immediately fell to his knees and began to apologize for his mistake and promised Joshua that this would not happen again. But it was already too late, and the guy told him that he would not be forgiven twice, because after he tried to harm his mother, the boy could have simply destroyed him. But still, Joshua gave him a chance, which he did not take advantage of and seems to want to repeat the fate of Lloyd and Gort. The centurions, who were laughing the most, suddenly fell silent and could not believe that the reason why Lloyd and Gort were not here was because they were beaten by Count Joshua. Rawls still tried his best to beg Joshua's forgiveness, but the guy gave him a clear understanding that there would be no second chance, but since he was a centurion of the Duchy of Agnes, he would allow him to preserve his honor. After which, Joshua immediately asked Rolls to take out his sword, and if he could defeat the Count, he would pretend that nothing happened and let him go. Rolls understood that he essentially had no choice, and he had to give it his all. Perhaps then he would have a chance. He immediately took out his sword and went on the attack, because he perfectly understood that his opponent was still a child, and if he did everything in his power, then he could succeed. But it seemed that this was all Joshua was after, so as soon as the centurion approached him, the guy used one of his signature stances and used a blow that was called a lightning slash, which helped to deal a rather strong blow to Rolls. It would be almost impossible to recover after such a blow, and looking at Rolls, one got the impression that this was the case, because he didn't even show signs of life. While the other centurions tried to understand how this could happen, Joshua asked each of them to listen carefully and said that judging an opponent based on his appearance would result in death for them on the battlefield. He also added that if any of them still had doubts about his abilities, he offered to approach him and check them again. Suddenly, one of the centurions began to approach the boy, and Joshua was already thinking that he would still have to continue the battle. But suddenly, to everyone who was there, this guy introduced himself as the 23rd leader of the centurions, and he greets Count Joshua. After this act, all the other centurions, or rather their leaders, knelt before Count Joshua and waited for his orders. Cain did not doubt for a second about his lord, and it seems he made the right choice, because Joshua met all his expectations, so from now on he will do everything possible to support his lord. Cheryl was sitting in the living room and was very worried about all the words that Joshua said to her and how he essentially drove her away, She was very offended. Suddenly, Cox decided to dispel her sadness, who literally flew into her room with the words that he had good news, the essence of which was that the order of imperial knights would soon arrive in the duchy. But for the young lady, not only did this not help, it also seemed to make the situation worse, so she collapsed exhausted on her bed and asked her not to disturb her anymore. Cox began to worry a little about her, because it seemed to him that something was hurting her, but he was very busy in the morning and did not notice. The girl was already tired of repeating the same thing 1,000 times, so she had to shout to Cox to leave the room and not bother her. Besides, he was here on a completely different matter. Cox immediately realized that he had completely forgotten about his lord's order, and that he first needed to carry out his lord's orders. The man realized that he needed to run away immediately and left the girl alone, and she fell on the bed and thought only about how Joshua had behaved with her. Almost immediately after the incident with the centurion, Agnes called the boy to him to find out personally from him why he executed the centurion. Joshua was not going to hide it or make excuses in any way, so he spoke without further ado. He was sure that the Duke probably knew how this centurion had behaved with his mother, so following the military regulations, he immediately executed the offender. The Duke mentally understood Joshua's decision, because if he himself had been there, he probably would not have resisted and would have cut them in half with his blade. But the boy answered that it was a rather hasty decision. Joshua could not stand it at that moment and answered his father that if he believed that these were the actions of a little boy who simply could not restrain his emotions, then this was not true at all. The guy explained to him that a few days ago he was the son of a concubine, and it was quite difficult for him to gain their trust, even considering the fact that he had gained strength. Even after these words, the Duke did not quite understand why the guy did this, so he again had to explain that he wanted to sow fear in them. In this way, he wanted to make sure that they would no longer dare to speak ill of him or his mother, also to show that he also had the blood of the Duke in him, so he had to demonstrate this to all the centurions. From that moment on, everything became clear to Agnes, but he decided not to focus on this, so he asked the guy to go and prepare for the trip, so that they could evaluate the power of his mana. Agnes also added that the Order of Imperial Knights had been expelled, which Joshua already knew very well, and added that as soon as he was ready, he would immediately leave. The first leader of the Order of the Golden Mane, Armstrong, could not believe that 2 high-ranking knights, who were also minors, would come from their duchy. Chiffon was very angry when he heard such statements, so he added that even if this was so, then one of them is still the son of a concubine. Armstrong understood perfectly well that Chiffon was angry only because his position was at stake. Due to the fact that young Master Babylon lost to Junior Master Joshua, these words hurt Chiffon too much, and he asked him not to talk nonsense. Their conversation was interrupted by the Duke himself, who reminded them that the Knights of the Imperial Order would soon arrive, and that it was advisable not to quarrel. They immediately calmed down and greeted the Duke according to all the rules, which showed exceptional respect. Armstrong at that moment was looking not at the Duke, but at the one who was next to him, and could not believe his eyes that he was looking at that same Master Joshua, because he did not look too strong, and all the legends about him were clearly exaggerated. As expected, the Imperial Knights arrived on time, and Joshua froze in anticipation. Chiffon at that moment understood that a whole battalion was approaching them right now, and it was unclear who the Emperor had sent there, since the whole battalion had arrived. The 4th Prince of the Emperor came out of the carriage, who was delighted with the Duchy of Agnes, and was delighted with the beauty. The Duke himself could not believe that he was seeing the 4th Prince here, it was so exciting for him. But not for Joshua, who knew very well that this prince's name was Caesar von Brighton, and the guy was not ready for this moment to come so quickly. The knight begged Sir Joker to spare him and stop, but the man did not want to hear anything, and simply walked forward. He struck this guy with a smile and was glad without an iota of regret that he had done just that. This man's name was Joker, and he was the captain of the first army of Imperial Knights, and most of all in his life he did not like to be told what to do. He was with his friend, who did not understand who would want to join the Imperial Order of Knights if the Joker mocked newcomers like that, to which the man replied that he could not stand them, because they showed off only because they could use a little mana. By the way, the man himself wanted to ask his friend why he came to him at such a time. The knight who stood in the fog slowly said that Madame Vanessa had a job for the Joker, and she really wanted the Joker to do it. All he had to do was make sure that little Joshua couldn't pick up a sword again. As soon as Caesar got out of the carriage, he immediately turned his attention to Joshua, about whom there were rumors throughout the empire. Joshua was very angry inside because he was so irritated and angry by this Caesar who was too pompous. One of the prince's servants politely asked to show respect, because he was still facing the prince. Joshua was so funny to hear this, because for him there are no two sons in the empire, except for the lord they serve. There is only one emperor who deserves the respect of all the knights of the Avalon Empire. After which the boy added that it seemed to him that there was no reason why he should show respect to the self-proclaimed fourth prince, so he was not going to do it. One of the prince's guards immediately ordered the Order of Knights to get ready, and he also added that little Joshua must be crazy to say such things. The man added that he heard that until recently he was only the son of a concubine who had to clean up horse shit. This man's name was Valmont Don Brown, and he was the deputy captain of the Ninth Order. One of the courtiers of the house came to the defense of Count Joshua, which was quite unexpected for Valmont. Therefore, the man decided to remind him that it is not Duke Agnes who is standing in front of him. Does he really want to protect this petty bastard? But Duke Agnes himself intervened in this skirmish, reminding them all that they were standing in front of the prince, and if they were not tired of living, they would immediately stop this madness. Valmont immediately recognized Duke Aidan Pawn Agnes, who was one of the 9 stars of the empire. Even his presence created incredible pressure. Agnes immediately stated the fact that this all happened because of Joshua, so he forced the guy to apologize to the prince. But the prince decided to answer this. He believed that everything was fine, and in some ways this guy was right, so no hard feelings. The young prince's assistant explained to him that many people were now looking at him, and such actions could undermine the authority of the imperial family. But the prince explained to him that he was very weak, and if he defended his honor, he would most likely make himself a laughing stock. Moreover, Caesar believed that Joshua was absolutely right. The only one who is worthy of the respect of all the knights of the empire is His Majesty the Emperor. So he did not see anything wrong with this and asked the knights to calm down. He also added that knights must be prepared to answer for their words. He was sure that Count Joshua was aware of how useless the empty words of a knight who has no skills are. Joshua carefully looked at how the prince behaved and smiled, because he had not changed a bit. He was still trying to solve all his problems with just his tongue, but this time, the guy would not forgive him for this. The count only thought that when the prince had everything, he would take it away, and then cut his throat, and that would be the end of it. One of the knights of the order asked the prince for forgiveness, but he has a great desire to personally test Count Joshua and test his mana. He would like to personally make sure that the count has enough skills to speak such words. Caesar told him that he was taking the count's safety into account, and he thought it would be better if the evaluator was Sir Joker, who had surpassed the level of a B-rank expert, due to their difference in strength. The Joker was very happy to hear this, and thanked the prince for such a generous gift. He would gladly appreciate Count Joshua's mana. Sir Joker decided that the guy was mocking him, because he took only an iron rod with him to the battle. The man asked to take his normal weapon, because they are not playing games here. After which the man asked Joshua if everything seemed so easy to him only because people around him praised him for his talent, that even a little boy allowed himself to insult the prince. Joshua did not answer such questions, although in response he asked the man why he loves to wag his tongue so much. Is it really possible that they are chosen as imperial knights only because of their talent for speaking? Joker immediately promised him that he would regret his words, because here it would be decided whether the count knew how to use mana only based on the battle with him. But before Sir Joker could finish speaking, Joshua had already gone on the attack and delivered his first blow, which was very difficult for the knight to block. Joker couldn't understand how this was even possible. It's such a strong mana that it's difficult even for him to restrain it. It looks like this kid can do something after all. But in the end, he didn't care, because his main task was to close the distance and strike, which he began to do. Joshua did not stop smiling, because he liked it so much that those who fight him think only that they will only have to close the distance to defeat him, but this weakness was minimized by long and hard training. He immediately responded to Sir Joker with a strong blow using his wand. Again, it was quite difficult for the man to block such a blow. But at one point, Joshua got tired of these games, so he decided to use his signature stance and blow, which he usually called a lightning slash. The Joker was not as simple as the Centurions, but still he is an experienced knight, so he was able to easily repulse this blow, and it seems that now he will go on a counterattack. The prince really liked this battle because it is so incredible to fight on equal terms with a B-rank knight at that age, but his guard noticed the fact that it only seems so at first glance, because in fact, Sir Joker does not show all his skills. But in any case, even he had to admit that in addition to mana, Joshua has excellent command of a spear, and his technique is quite unusual. The guy has seen such a thing for the first time. The Joker fought back blow after blow, and thought that if everything continued like this, the testing would end, and if this happened, he would lose his head, so he decided to take a risk. Joshua was also thinking about his opponent at that moment, and no matter how much he wanted to, he still had to admit the fact that the B-rank knight is much stronger than Babylon with whom he fought. Controlling mana is becoming more and more difficult. The Joker understood that the only one who could stop him was Agnes, so he decided to try anyway and dealt a completely different level of blow, which Joshua seemed unable to block. The Duke's knight suddenly jumped up from his seat as soon as he saw that Joker had struck much harder than necessary. His mana was now above B rank. Count Joshua was in danger. Duke Agnes saw what was happening even without his prompting, so he asked the man to sit down and calmly watch what was happening. Joker was pleasantly surprised when he realized that the kid had blocked his blow by concentrating mana in one place, but in any case it wouldn't work a second time. Joshua tried to hold on until the last, and it was getting harder and harder to block the blow. He had to come up with something immediately. Joker felt that he could right now carry out the order that was in his head, and at the same time he told Joshua that there was no point in collecting the rest of his mana, because the battle was already over. The Knight of the Order shouted to Sir Joker to immediately stop this madness, because at this rate the boy could be harmed. But the man did not listen to anyone but himself, so he continued to go into battle no matter what, and in the end, he delivered such a strong blow that it created a small explosion. The Joker didn't understand what was happening here, because after such a blow the fight should have been over, but by some miracle he was thrown back. What's going on here? But as soon as he raised his eyes upward, he saw an incredibly incomprehensible picture for himself. Joshua was standing in absolutely excellent condition and was now holding a rod of some incredible power in his hands. Joshua was only thinking about this sword aura. It seems to be around the level of a rank B expert, and this is very bad news for the guy, because if things continue like this, he will most likely lose. The Joker was not going to stop there, so he went into battle with the words that the boy was simply wasting energy, collecting the remnants of his mana. The knight went into battle and only thought that when the C-rank mana of this short man collided with his B-rank sword's aura, even a simple recoil from such a thing could cause serious damage, and so he could fulfill his duty. Joshua had no other choice, so he decided to use a different plan and asked Rugia for help. The knight who was near the prince suggested stopping the test, which had already gone too far, to which the prince replied to his friend that even if Joshua lacks experience in battle, he still thinks that Count Joshua is amazing. The Joker still stood in a stupor, realizing that a 9-year-old boy had just been able to parry his attack, and there was no understanding of how he was able to do this. In any case, the man gathered all his strength into a fist and assured Master Joshua that this was the end for him. And just as he wanted to go on the attack, he was stopped just in time by Sir Valmont, who thanked the Joker for his efforts, but the testing was over. Sir Valmont himself could not believe the fact that Joshua was able to block the attack of a rank B Joker in a simple mana test. The man could not even imagine that this genius would be stronger than Valmont himself, but this little boy is truly worthy. Therefore, he had no other choice than to read that, according to the order of His Majesty, the second son of the Duchy of Agnes, Joshua von Agnes, was awarded the title of Knight C rank. Joshua wasn't going to play along with this knight or anything like that, but on the other hand, he understood that any more and he would faint. The guy really didn't want to show his weaknesses in front of the prince, but on the other hand, he understood perfectly well that there wasn't much difference. In any case, he would take revenge and take everything from him. His thoughts were interrupted by Agnes, who approached his son with questions about how he was feeling, because the battle was indeed difficult. For the first time in his life, Joshua sees such an expression on his father's face. He has never seen such a face in his previous life. It turns out that he can still look like that. Joshua took the sword in his hands, told his father that everything was fine, and raised the sword above his head. And on this day, the youngest mana user in the history of the Avalon Empire was born. That same night, a meeting was held in the Duchy of Agnes, at which the most important persons of the duchy gathered. One of these respected people asked everyone to report only on important things. This man's name was Count Angel. He was the main vassal of the duchy. One of the knights reported that all the summoned knights suddenly returned, due to the fact that the number of monsters that appeared from the forest seemed to have increased greatly. To be precise, the main reason why the knights returned was the appearance of the Black Ogre. The Black Ogre is the strongest creature of the Dark Forest, also called the Monster's Hideout. A strong troll that tears bodies into pieces like paper. Its strength is equal to a 4th-level magician or higher. The council that gathered at this meeting suddenly began to panic when they heard about the Black Ogre, because for them it was so terrible, and if this monster gets to the property, will they be able to defeat it? But suddenly their panic was interrupted by Agnes, who said that he would take care of this issue himself and should not worry so much, so he asked them to move on to the next topic. The council was not against it, and, as it turned out, the second concerned the 5 duchies, which was also worth discussing. Agnes didn't quite understand why they were raising this topic. Was there really another reason why Cheryl and Cox came here? Still, the Duke did not really want to discuss such issues in front of the entire council, so he asked his assistant to tell him about it personally after the preparations. The person who controlled order at these gatherings asked everyone who still had any questions to report, and suddenly a hand was raised. Chiffon endured almost the entire meeting, but still decided to ask his question, which directly concerned Count Joshua. As soon as the council heard this name, they immediately became active, because Joshua became the youngest C-rank knight, surpassing the Count of Babylon. This is a great event for the Agnes Duchy, but they were asked to calm down and listen to what Commander Chiffon was about to say. Chiffon said that until recently no one remembered Count Joshua, and besides, he was weak due to the curse of mana. Therefore, the commander was primarily interested in the question of how someone like that could suddenly become a knight of C rank, because it is very difficult to explain all this with one talent. He said all this to lead to the fact that he suspects that Count Joshua takes power from demons or monsters, otherwise he cannot explain this situation. Armstrong believed that these were all stupid guesses, but Chiffon stood his ground and added that he was not the only one who saw the weapon that the Count used during the battle, which was able to change its shape. Is it possible that anything other than artifacts filled with magic can change its shape? Moreover, in addition to everything, the weapon that Count Joshua used was similar to a spear. Such power cannot be found in a simple spear. The aura that he felt when he attacked Sir Joker was close to demonic magic. Now the council switched to little Joshua, and now they thought that the Count could use the power of demons, which was prohibited in the duchy. Agnes sat silently and listened to what everyone said about how their dukedom was in danger, and they had to find out the truth. Almost everyone agreed with this, and they believed that this needed to be done before it was too late. Chiffon completed his task and ensured that the council is now far from being on the side of Joshua and his forces, and it seems they even want to take the count away to avoid problems. But suddenly there was complete silence in the council chamber, and all because Joshua entered here and abruptly opened the doors. He passed by Chiffon and laughed at him and his guesses about monsters, and also invited him to personally test his strength if he so suspects him. Chiffon was outraged by such impudence, and he asked the guy to repeat what he just said. Joshua turned to him and told him that he should be able to determine if he had indeed borrowed power from the monster if he chose to blame him for it, and Joshua believed that he was right. Chiffon thought that Joshua is too cunning because he forces him to turn the sword against someone in whose body the blood of his master flows, and one wrong move and the master's anger will be directed at him. But on the other hand, he also understood that if this baby's strength was truly his, then serious consequences awaited him. Chiffon was already very angry inside, so Joshua also decided to add fuel to the fire, saying that the commander is a very indecisive person. Was he really scared and lacking courage? Isn't Chiffon one of the 4 pillars of the duchy? The commander jumped up from his seat and in a rude voice told Count Joshua that he was already going too far beyond the limits of what was available. The council tried to reassure Commander Chiffon because he was not alone here, and moreover, was in the presence of Duke Agnes. Agnes agreed with them and asked them to immediately stop the quarrel and move on to more important matters. After which the Duke added that there is one thing that they all cannot understand, including Chiffon. Don't they know who was present at the mana testing? Armstrong answered this question by saying that the Imperial Order of Knights and the chief magician of the Imperial Evergrande Palace, so if Joshua used the powers of monsters, then someone would definitely notice it. After these words, Agnes looked at the council and believed that all possible issues that concern Joshua can be considered resolved. However, the Duke told Joshua that this did not mean that they had everything figured out. There were still things they were not sure about and questions they would like answers to. Moreover, the reasons for his sudden acquisition of power are of interest not only to the vassals, but also to the Duke. Therefore, in order to finally understand his strength, the Duke decided to take the boy with him into the dark forest. The council was surprised that Agnes was going to go into the dark forest, because it seemed to them that it would be better to leave this task to experienced knights. There was no need to expose themselves to such danger. Armstrong agreed with the counts because soon you need to go to Acadia, so you should be careful with your health, and if the Duke gets hurt. But before they could finish speaking, they were interrupted by Agnes, who informed them that as soon as he dealt with the dark forest, he next planned to send Joshua to the Imperial Capital Academy. The Duke looked at his son and added to each of them that he absolutely did not care what they thought of him. His talent was undeniable, and according to the rules of the Agnes family, he would give him a chance. Chiffon was too unhappy with this because even now Joshua looks promising, but the Imperial Academy is out of their reach. And if he returns from there much stronger, then the Count of Babylon will be embroiled in a war of succession, so Chiffon decided that he needs to make sure that he stays there forever. Suddenly Joshua himself spoke, who came to this hall to ask for one of his requests to be fulfilled. His main request and desire was that he wanted to go to the capital with his mother. Chiffon immediately intervened in their conversation and said that this is impossible. If only Lady Lucia goes to the capital, Lady Vanessa will not just stand by. Joshua asked him in response, did he really think that the Duke needed permission to do something like that? There was silence in the hall, and Chiffon understood that if he had said that, it would probably have been taken as advice to listen to the Duchess more. Then the wrath of all the gods would have fallen upon him. He felt as if this child was playing with him, so he decided to say that he was a little worried about the possibility that he was praising Lady Lucia. But the Duke did not give the commander the opportunity to finish. He turned to Joshua and said that he would allow Lucia to go with him, for which the boy was very grateful to him. At that moment, Agnes thought about the fact that he knew very well that he was an unusual child. He himself did not understand, since when he began to notice this, even Babylon was not like that. The Duke decided everything and added to Armstrong that as soon as he dealt with the reports of the Font family, he asked him to come to his room with the sent knight. Agnes was also about to leave and added to Joshua that he should also go into his room. As soon as everyone thought that the preparations were over, Babylon entered the council room, asking everyone to stay here for a while, because he had something to say. Babylon immediately approached the Duke and greeted him. Agnes was glad to see him, but today he was late, because their training had long been over. The guy immediately asked for forgiveness. He explained all this by saying that he needed to put his thoughts in order so he could not come on time. Agnes looked at his eldest son and also noticed that Babylon had changed. Even the air around him had become different. This was very good. The Duke understood that he had come here to say something important, so he asked him not to hesitate and speak. Babylon did not wait long and began to fulfill the Duke's request, so he immediately turned to Joshua. Joshua understood that there might now be another provocation, so he treated it with a smile and asked what he needed from him. Chiffon at this time was boiling over the behavior of Count Joshua, because Babylon has a higher position in society, and this is a public place, so you should watch your manners. Joshua in response asked Chiffon, "Or is he not by chance a representative of Babylon?" Then he added that he always behaves like an obedient dog of a count. He became an honorary nobleman only thanks to Duke Agnes, so he asked the man to remember who his owner is. Chiffon knew full well that he had a line that he shouldn't cross when it came to the dukedom. If he looked like he was too involved, he would be expelled. So he decided to say that he was just correcting him because he believed that Count Joshua was not in course about such norms of behavior. The guy believed that anyone could climb the career ladder as long as his skills were with him, and if you want to be listened to, you first need to prove that you are worthy. The commander had already begun to boil with anger when suddenly he was interrupted by Babylon himself, who told him that everything was fine and that Joshua was right after all. Agnes looked at Babylon and thought that not so long ago, a child full of vanity turned into someone with a look in his eyes reminiscent of the look of a real knight. Once Chiffon calmed down, Babylon finally said what he wanted so badly. He repeated the words that Joshua told him, that he must prove himself with his own skills, so he will become stronger and will not simply give in to his brother. Joshua was glad that from their second duel his look became completely different, so he could not answer his brother with anything other than agreement. After which Babylon turned to the Duke and asked him something that no one expected. The guy decided to refuse the place of heir to Agnes. The council and everyone who was inside this room were shocked by this decision. Could the guy really just give up? Agnes asked him a question in which he wanted to know if he had lost confidence in himself due to the appearance of a more talented opponent. Babylon answered him in a confident voice that of course not, but according to the rules of the Agnes family house, he wants to observe a fair fight. The Duke was surprised that the guy had changed so much that he even came to such a conclusion, so he promised him that he would definitely consider his appeal. After Babylon thanked the Duke for his kindness, Agnes announced that the meeting was now officially over. Agnes left the hall with the thought that this place had begun to change significantly, and he liked it. He wanted to see what it would become in the end, but he had a good feeling. Vanessa in her room simply could not believe what Chiffon was telling her. How could Babylon give up her position? Still, she couldn't stand it and started breaking everything, because for her, it was like a terrible dream that turned into reality. Ever since those centurions screwed up, she's been trying to control her anger, but it's getting harder and harder every day. She tried to explain to Chiffon that Babylon meant absolutely everything to her, but the commander already understood this perfectly well, so he tried to tell her that he should have done everything in his power to convince the count. But the woman didn't think so, because she, like no one, knows how stubborn Babylon can be, just like his father, so she believed that Chiffon could not do anything. She was also sure that this would not have happened if it were not for this Joshua who would want to take over the position of her Babylon, so she believed that she would have to tell this man about their circumstances. Chiffon promised her that this would not happen and that he would take care of everything. She had no doubt that everything would be fine, but she was interested to know what the man was going to do next. The commander reported to her that tomorrow the Duke would go with him to the Forbidden Territory. Vanessa knows very well that this is a barren northern territory where it takes at least 2 days to get there. As Chiffon explained to her, this was again connected with the dark forest, and the Duke said that he wanted to figure everything out himself. Vanessa understood perfectly well that as soon as they returned to the estate, he would go with Lucia to the capital. Chiffon confirmed this information, and then the lady asked him to tell him that before he leaves, she would like to have lunch with him. This will be their first and last meeting. One of the warriors of the duchy was surprised that the imperial knights who came to assess the mana were already leaving. But they immediately put his brains in place, because one of the main ones at this point shouted at him and, to put it mildly, asked him not to cool off, because they were leaving soon. As soon as the meeting came to an end, Joshua went into the Duke's office, in which the man told him that as soon as everything calmed down with the dark forests, they would immediately go to Acadia, and until that moment he should forget that he was Agnes. So Agnes decided to give Joshua something to keep him relatively safe. He said that he once helped the guardian of a magic tower, and this Ring of Dawn was his reward for his help. If this is the Ring of Dawn of the guardian of a magic tower, then this is one of the artifacts created by the guardian personally. When mana is poured into this ring, it immediately equips the wearer with armor. Agnes did not explain to the guy how to use this ring. All he told him was to just pour in mana, and then he would understand how to use it. Joshua was so glad to hear this, but not because this ring is so strong, but because he knew very well that this ring was intended for the heir. The Duke asked him not to take everything in that light. He just couldn't watch it gather dust without use, and it was just a waste of the power of this item, so he just decided to lend it to Joshua, although that's not all. Joshua was surprised when he heard the fact that there is another reason, so Agnes added that when using this ring, he will be wearing enhanced armor, and this armor has the distinctive marks of each family. And as Agnes said, this is necessary in order to hide his identity from the insects that will be nearby, because he hates sacrificing something for the benefit of others. After which he added that Joshua was now the heir of an unknown viscount, so he advised him to come up with a good name. Joshua understood that there must be a reason why he needed to hide his identity, the same as the reason why he lent him the ring. It was so that there would be no consequences in the future. The guy thought that this ring would be quite useful in situations where big shots like the prince would come after him, but suddenly Agnes interrupted his thoughts. He suddenly asked the guy if he was angry with him. Joshua himself didn't fully know whether he was offended or not, because he himself had never thought about it. Even Duke Agnes could not expect that he would die in vain in the war between empires that would happen 10 years later. Probably, if you choose the reason why Joshua is offended, it is that he left him and his mother without protection, which is why Joshua's mother eventually died. The guy rarely saw the Duke in a past life, so he slowly forgot about this insult. They say time heals wounds. Has it really formed some kind of attachment between father and son? Caesar noticed that Joshua looked like something good had happened, so he decided to ask what happened to him. But without waiting for an answer from the guy, the prince told him that he had heard that after the dark summer, Joshua would go to Acadia, so he decided to ask the guy to come visit him, because the prince believed that it would be quite useful for him. Joshua didn't fully understand what the prince meant. Why should it be useful? Caesar explained to him that the imperial family could assign the knight who would protect them to the order of the imperial knights. Then he could serve as an imperial knight without passing the annual exam, and it would not be necessary to undergo 10 years of service. In other words, Caesar added that if Sir Joshua wanted, then after using the privileges, he could leave the order at any time. After which the prince smiled and told him that he wanted Joshua to know that the guy was usually stingy with such generous offers. Joshua looked into his face and thought only that this laughter mixed with pretense and hypocrisy was truly disgusting, and if it weren't for those guys behind him, he would have already thrust his sword right into the prince's mouth. However, he needs to join the Imperial Knights to obtain another favorite weapon from his past life, all because his weapons are kept in a secret warehouse inside the Imperial Palace, which can only be accessed once a year. And this is only if you join the Imperial Knights and become a battalion commander. But now Joshua decided that he needed to focus on the task first, so he replied that he would think about his proposal, and now it was time for him to go. One of the courtiers noted that if Joshua's humility had matched his skills, he would have made steady progress. But Sir Valmont was interrupted by Prince Caesar, who asked him not to be like that, especially since it was time for them to return home. They separated and each had different thoughts in his head. The prince thought that in any case Joshua would be his, and the guy himself at that moment was sure that this time he would not become Caesar's puppy. Joshua was sure that this time the one who would suffer would be only one person, and it would be the prince. An expedition to the Black Forest led by Duke Agnes was soon formed, and his men were ready to leave. First of all, the expedition consisted of a rather small group led by the Duke. It was just a group from the Order of the Crimson Knights and Armand, the only fourth-class magician in the Duchy of Agnes.